Hello, my name is Anita. I'm a senior UX designer at Unity. I have been there for the last 5 years, and I've learned a lot about designing for complex softwares. A little bit about me, I like to make games and play games, and this is my cat Muji. And yeah, so for those of you who don't know what Unity is, this is what Unity looks like. So not as bad as the slide I showed just now, but still relatively complex. And Unity is what we call a game engine. So for those of you who don't know, game engine is a type of software that game developers use to create games. Currently, 70% of the mobile games out on the app stores are made with Unity. Even if you aren't really into gaming, it's hard to go by without knowing a couple of games that have been made by Unity, such as Pokemon Go or Among Us. So this engine was first launched in 2005 by 3 guys in Denmark with the aim to democratize game development by making it accessible to more developers. Very noble goal. And as you can imagine, game development is hard, and therefore game engines are pretty hard to use as well. So I have had a lot of experience with this in the last 5 years. So today I want to share with you what I've learned designing for creators. In the 25 minutes we have, I'm going to go over some basic problems of what the crux of the problem is, and then go over a few design strategies as well as case studies for how you can deal with it. So to begin, the crux of the problem of designing for complex software as a UX designer is something I like to call the power usability dilemma. And this is a good example of it. So on the left, we have iMovie, which is a very easy to use interface, very easy to learn. Literally, my grandpa used to use this to make home movies. So I think that's a testament to how accessible it is. And on the right, we have Adobe Premiere Pro, which is a professional editing software that people use to make Hollywood movies. So as you can see, the interface is a lot more intimidating. It's a lot more compact, but in no way is it badly designed. It was just designed for different needs. And this is something that we tend to see a lot across different industries and different softwares. As a tool scales in complexity, the harder it is to keep it usable. And that's because of a variety of reasons. As your paying customers becomes professional developers who want power and specific fine-tuned controls, your software becomes crowded with functionality. You have to think about things like scalability. So usability, unfortunately, often becomes an afterthought. So you might be thinking, why is this a problem? Why should I care? I'll use my iMovie, and the professionals can use the Adobe Premiere Pro. Well, a lot of times, these softwares are what is considered the industry standard. And I think this is especially a problem in creative industries, not because creators cannot deal with complexity or they're not technical. It's just that creators tend to come from a lot more diverse of a background. And unfortunately, a lot of times, the complexities in these software become a barrier to entry rather than an enabler of their creativity. So, of course, no software developer sets out to gatekeep their software from beginners. It's unfortunately just, as I mentioned, a reality of the power usability dilemma. Sometimes what's useful for novice users becomes frustrating for expert users. So that beautiful motion design you did on that button becomes a slow animation that is hindering their process. And the clean minimalist interface becomes, why did you hide this thing I need to do 20 times a day behind 5 different menus that I have to click? So yeah, so as you can imagine, for a product like Unity, we encounter this a lot. And for me, as a product designer, I personally really resonated with one of the founding principles of making game development more accessible to more developers. So for me, this is a subject I'm very passionate about. So in the spirit of the theme of today's conference of redefining possible, I want to challenge the idea that complex softwares have to be difficult to use. I think with good UX, we can redefine what's possible making tools more intuitive and accessible without sacrificing the depth. So onto the strategies. The first one is defining the user. Is it really a UX talk if I don't talk about users? But I'm not gonna start from the beginning and talk about personas. We're all professionals here. I think we've all heard a little bit about those. I want to specifically talk about two things that I think are things I've learned that's kind of specific to users of complex softwares. So I've talked a lot about inclusive designs and why it's important, but I want to make a disclaimer that inclusive design does not literally mean you start by designing for everyone. I think it's very important that you focus first and then expand after, because when you start trying to design for everyone, you're really designing for no one, and the tool becomes unintuitive for all your user profiles. So ideally, what you can do is ask yourself questions like, who is most critical to the tool's success, and what trade-offs are we making by prioritize these person? And then once your team has aligned on who your primary user is, you start focusing there, make sure all their workflows and needs and pain points are addressed, and then you expand and layer the other users. So picking a primary does not mean that you don't care about everyone else. Picking a primary is just a good way to focus first and then expand later. The second thing I want to talk about is kind of the advancement of skill levels as a user becomes more of an expert. So here's just a quick little table to kind of talk about the difference between beginner and advanced users. So basically, in a nutshell, beginner users tend to value things like guidance and simplicity and clear onboarding, whereas advanced users care more about depth of functionality and control, and the rest of those things tend to kind of fall by the wayside, as we mentioned. However, this is not really a linear scale. In my experience, it doesn't really look like this. Instead, it kind of looks like a Pokemon with two final evolution, like the Applin. So as a user gets more advanced, I think there's actually a distinction between an advanced user and a power user. So sometimes the difference is a little subtle, and sometimes they might be the same person. But essentially, where the advanced user is someone who's pushing the technology of your software, who's trying to do as much as they could with what's possible. The power user is just someone who has to do this thing for 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they need speed and they need efficiency. And they need things like customizations and shortcuts and automation. So it's important kind of when you're talking to different users to realize which one they are. Like I mentioned, sometimes it could be the same person, but it's also important to identify which of these advanced user your tool is trying to solve for, because like I mentioned, they kind of have different needs. So that's on users. Moving on, let's talk about strategy number 2, which is prioritizing workflows over features. So to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to use VFX graph as an example. So if you don't know what VFX graph looks like in Unity, this is what it looks like. It is a node-based tool that people use to create things that look like this. So visual effects in games are usually used for things like explosions or like a magic blast or things like that. So in this example, the developers of VFX Graph wants to make templates. And oftentimes, this is how Jiras and epics are structured. And it's a very development forward thinking, which is fine. That's how you get things done. But what's not great is when this type of like feature-driven work thinking spills over to the workflows. So the features is what I like to call the what. So literally like what are we making? And in this case is templates. And this type of thinking tend to lead to UI that look like this, which is literally just a giant list of what are we doing? What can you do? So with a feature-driven mindset, you might be tempted to just add the templates to the bottom of where you create your VFX and call it a day. However, if we stop and think about why we're making these things and who we're making it for, which is a more workflow-driven approach, you might start to think a little bit more about who you're creating for. So in this case, the reason why advanced users want templates is because they have created so many VFX graphs that they already know what they want to do, and having to start from scratch every time is inefficient and a waste of time, in their opinion. But on the contrary, for a beginner user, they want templates for a different reason. For beginner users, opening the graph to a blank canvas is extremely intimidating and scary. So with a more workflow forward approach, we might end up with a window that looks a little bit more like this. So we know that the beginner users are intimidated and uninspired by just opening a blank canvas. So instead of just giving them a list, we can give them a list with well-designed icons. So at a glance, they can have an idea of what this is for. And for the advanced user who already knows what they want to create, instead of giving them a list of text where they have to try and guess what each of them means, you can specifically click each one and then have a preview as well as a description so they know that what they're adding to their graph is actually what they want. Moving on to the last strategy, complexity on demand. This term is a very popular saying within designers at Unity because, as I've established, Unity is quite the complex software. And to illustrate what I mean by complexity on demand, I will use VFX graph as an example again. And this time I'm going to talk about something called attributes. So I'm going to try and attempt to explain the context and set the stage for what attributes are. If you can follow along, great. If you get lost, don't worry, I'll call you back when my explanation is over. And we'll talk about why it's bad and how we solved it. So to understand what attributes are, first we have to understand what properties are. So properties are basically variables. They're just called properties in Unity because we need to have our own name for things. But essentially, variables are data types like Booleans, floats, vector2, vector3, things like that. And the purpose of a property in GraphTool is you can create a property here in the Blackboard and then reuse it in multiple places in the graph. So that way you ensure the same value is being used to drive multiple functionalities. And when you change the value here, it changes everywhere else in the graph. So you can probably see why that could become very helpful. It's also just kind of like, the purpose of declaring a variable when you're scripting. And another useful thing of variables is that they can be exposed to the grader inspector, so then you can kind of see it in action of the thing you're trying to make. So here you can see that when I change the max velocity, the speed at which the butterflies fly start to change. So now that we know what properties are, let's talk about attributes. So attributes is a very VFX specific term. And that is because VFX is essentially a particle system where there are thousands of particles that exist at the same time. And a lot of times, each of these particles have their own direction that they're facing. They have their own velocity that they're going at. So attributes are essentially a system-provided variable that kind of tells you where this particle currently is or what's the current size of a particle. So the usefulness of attributes is you can take attributes, which, for example, here you can get the current velocity of any butterflies, and then multiply it, do a bunch of math, and then get the max velocity. So as you can see, attributes tend to end up also being data types, and because of that, there's a lot of similarities between that and properties. So if I've lost you, it's okay, you can come back now. So that was the stage setting, but what's most important is what's wrong with attributes now. So currently, this is how you create attributes in Unity. You have to open a right-click menu, create this thing, which is a node library, which is a searcher where you search for nodes and you add things into your graph. And then you go through, like 2 different folders, and you eventually end with this giant list of, just text. So that's how you currently find attributes and use attributes. And this is not great for anyone. Like, no one is having a good time. For the advanced user, a lot of times when you need to use attributes is similar to when you need to use properties. But for properties, they have an easy to access board and they can just drag and drop. But for attributes, you have to dig through so many menus, it's hard to find, etc. And for the power user, as you can see, this is definitely way too many clicks for any power user. It's literally like 5 clicks from empty to grabbing something into your graph. And lastly, for the beginner user, the list is overwhelming and confusing. When you finally arrive at the final list, you have no idea what it means, what the context is. And most importantly, it was also crowding the search results. So when you're just trying to search for other nodes, these things were popping up and it's making your search results look a lot more crowded than necessary. So with the idea of complexity on demand, what we did was we added tabs to the Blackboard. And it seems very simple, but I will kind of walk through why this becomes complexity on demand. So for the beginner user, you will always open the graph, and the graph will start on the Properties tab. So in this sense, it is essentially the exact same as the Blackboard as you know it before. It's just there for variables. If you don't know what attributes are and you don't want to know, you never have to click that tab. You can just live here forever. For the advanced users, attributes now is easily findable. It's just a tab in the Blackboard, and it is also very easily browsable. And you can clearly see at a glance what these are and what they're doing. And for the beginner users who happen to stumble upon these, it looks less intimidating because now we've also added things like icons that kind of show you the data type of these attributes, making it look a lot less intimidating. And then lastly, we added a alt tab, which is mostly for the power users. So we got feedback from power users that they don't really want to switch between two tabs. They don't really mind the complexity of just having a giant list in their Blackboard. So for them, this is a tab where they can live in, where they have access to both at all times. And that's it. So by redefining the UX of complex software, we can break down barriers that prevent new people from participating. And I think what seems impossible today, which is making complex software usable and intuitive, becomes possible when we rethink our approach to complexity. So that's my talk. Thank you for listening.